Welcome back to the deep dive. And I hope you're sitting down for this one because the stack of documents we are navigating today is, well, it's not just a rabbit hole. It's more like we found a trapdoor in the basement of history, kicked it open, and discovered a subterranean labyrinth that runs underneath the entire world.
That is definitely putting it mildly. Usually when we do these dives, we look at business trends or a specific historical event. But today we are looking at a collection of sources that claim to explain all of it. The wars, the financial crashes, the revolutions.
All of it. And I want to be extremely clear up front before we even jump in. We are stepping into a very specific, very controversial worldview today. We're analyzing texts like Fritz Springmeier's Bloodlines of the Illuminati, the Synagogue of Satan, the Two Babylons, and a whole stack of transcripts regarding the CIA, the Vatican, and various secret societies.
Right. These are definitely not your standard political science textbooks.
Not at all. And it's important to state that our mission here is purely to unpack the claims made in these materials. We aren't endorsing this worldview, and we aren't taking political or religious sides. We are just impartially reporting on the text to understand the architecture of what they claim is going on.
Exactly. Because these texts present a complete alternative history. They argue that what you see on the news, the politicians arguing, the treaties, the chaos, it's all just a puppet show.
Okay.
And their goal is to show you the strings.
And the hands pulling them. I mean, we're talking about the concept of a hidden hand or a shadow government. But when I was doing the prep reading for this, it struck me that they aren't talking about some vague group of greedy corporate lobbyists.
No, they're describing a literal, structured, centuries-old machine.
Right. The antagonist in these sources is described explicitly as a Satan organization. And they don't use that term as a metaphor for, bad guys. They mean a group with a very specific theological belief system that drives their geopolitical moves.
It's described in the text as a criminal syndicate on a global scale, a brotherhood of death. They map it out as this unholy trinity merging three specific groups: the black nobility, international bankers, and specific religious hierarchies.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that is just a massive claim. If you tell the average person the world is run by a secret group, they picture guys in a smoky room deciding the price of oil.
A James Bond villain setup.
Exactly. But the anatomy described in these books is much more rigid. It's almost military.
It's extremely hierarchical. Springmeier's work is probably the most detailed on this structure. He maps it out like a corporate org chart, but for global domination. So at the very bottom, you have the masses. That's you, me, the everyday people.
Right.
And right above us, you have the military, the government, the visible institutions.
The people we vote for.
Yes, the faces on TV. But in this worldview, those people are just middle management. They take orders. As you move up the pyramid, you get to the secret societies, Freemasonry, the Club of Rome, the Council on Foreign Relations.
That even they are just the outer shell.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. The administrative layer.
So who is actually in the boardroom? Who is at the top of this pyramid?
According to these texts, the absolute capstone is the Council of 13. They also refer to it as the Grand Druid Council.
The Grand Druid Council. I have to admit, when I read that, it sounded like something out of a fantasy novel.
It does sound fantastical. Yeah. But the sources are deadly serious about it. They claim this is the ultimate governing body of the Illuminati, and they argue these 13 individuals aren't just wealthy oligarchs. They act as high priests. The text claims they take direct orders from a spiritual entity.
You mean Satan?
Yes, or Lucifer. The sources argue that at this level of power, it's not about money anymore. They already control the money. It's entirely about spiritual servitude. And then beneath this Council of 13, you have what's called the Committee of 300.
Okay, I've actually heard of the Committee of 300. That's the group that handles the administrative side?
Correct. Think of the Council of 13 as the board of directors setting the vision, what they call the plan. The Committee of 300 is the executive team executing that strategy across banking, media, and the military.
Okay.
But the core engine of this entire structure is this concept of the 13 bloodlines.
This is the generational Satanism aspect of the texts.
Yes, and this is where the sources start naming names. They identify specific families that they allege are the absolute core of this syndicate. You have the ones everyone kind of expects from conspiracy lore, like the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers.
Right, the usual suspects.
Sure. But then it gets into families like the Astors, the Bundys, the Collins, the DuPonts, the Freemans, the Liz, the Van Dynes. It even lists the Kennedys and the Onassis family.
Wait, the Kennedys, as in JFK's family.
According to the sources, yes.
But hold on, didn't the quote-unquote hidden hand supposedly assassinate JFK? Why would they kill one of their own bloodline?
That's a really great question, and the texts actually address this directly. Remember, they describe this organization as a brotherhood of death. Loyalty is absolute, but so is the penalty for deviation.
He stepped out of line.
Exactly. The argument is that JFK went rogue. He started speaking publicly about secret societies. He tried to dismantle the CIA. He tried to print silver-backed currency, which was a direct threat to the international bankers.
So they viewed him as a traitor.
In their view, he was a member of the bloodline who broke the oath. And just like in a mafia, if you talk to the cops or go against the family, you get removed.
That is a chilling way to frame it. But let's step back to the bloodline concept itself. Why does the actual blood matter? Why can't they just recruit the smartest sociopath from Harvard to join the Council of 13?
Right. Why keep it in the family?
Yeah, why these specific families?
This is probably the hardest part for a modern, rational listener to grasp, but it's crucial to understanding the source material. The texts explain that these groups believe occult power is biological.
Biological, like it's literally in their DNA.
Yes, they believe it's carried in the blood. Springmeier discusses this at length. He argues that they view magical ability, specifically the ability to communicate with the spirit world and demonic entities, as a genetic trait.
Wow.
So if you marry outside the bloodline, that power gets diluted.
It's like breeding prize horses?
Exactly like that. It explains the historical obsession with royal inbreeding. The sources point out that European royalty married their cousins for centuries. History books tell us it was for political alliances and land.
But these texts claim something else.
They argue it was strictly to keep the sangreal, the holy bloodline, pure. They claim this lineage traces all the way back to the black nobility of Rome and even back to Babylon.
The black nobility. That term kept popping up in the research.
It refers to the oligarchical families of Venice and Genoa, who held immense power in the 12th century, but who trace their lineage back to the Roman emperors. The sources claim these families never actually lost their power. They just shifted their roles.
From being visible emperors to being behind-the-scenes bankers and popes.
Precisely. So the argument is that a Rockefeller or a DuPont today is essentially a genetic continuation of the same power structure from ancient Rome.
Okay, that brings us to the Illuminati. It's a word that gets thrown around in pop culture constantly. You see it in music videos, people making triangle hand signs. But how do these specific sources define it? Is it a club? A religion?
The sources describe the Illuminati not as a simple standalone club, but as the inner circle hidden entirely within other organizations, specifically Freemasonry.
No, wait. My grandfather was a Mason. He went to the lodge, ate pancake breakfasts, and organized charity drives. He definitely wasn't secretly ruling the world.
And the sources would completely agree with you. They actually have a term for men like your grandfather. They call them porch brethren.
Porch brethren.
Yes, because they're just on the porch. They see the nice facade of the house. They see the social club, the brotherhood, the charity work. But the texts argue that Freemasonry is structured as a system of concentric circles.
So the outer rings are completely innocent.
Exactly. The outer circles are for the good guys. But as you go deeper into the 30th, 31st, 32nd degrees, the teachings start to change.
And what happens when you hit the 33rd degree?
The sources claim that the 33rd degree is where the mask comes off. They cite Albert Pike heavily here. He was a very famous Masonic leader from the 19th century. In his writings, Pike discusses how the true secrets of Masonry are intentionally concealed from the lower degrees.
So they are deliberately lying to their own members.
They are meant to be misled, yes. The Illuminati sits at that very top level, the inner core, directing the massive global organization of Masonry without the vast majority of normal Masons ever knowing what's actually going on.
It's basically the perfect camouflage. If anyone accuses the Masons of a dark conspiracy, the leadership can just point to millions of good, normal guys doing charity work and say, look how harmless we are.
It uses the genuine good reputation of the everyday members as a human shield for the leadership. And within that hidden core, you have even more secretive groups mentioned, like the Prieuré de Sion.
Right, the Prieuré de Sion. That's the stuff from the Da Vinci Code.
It is. But the twist in these texts is much darker than a Dan Brown novel. The Da Vinci Code suggests they are protecting the bloodline of Jesus Christ. These sources claim they are protecting the holy bloodline, but they believe it's the bloodline of the seed of the serpent.
The seed of the serpent? We're talking about the Garden of Eden here.
Yes.
Yeah.
The theology, and we'll get much deeper into the religious aspect later, but the core belief is that Eve actually had physical offspring with the serpent, resulting in Cain.
Okay.
And that this Cainite bloodline has survived through history and integrated with these specific elite families. They believe they are quite literally a different species than the rest of humanity.
That is, I
Yeah.
mean, it certainly explains why they might not care about the average person's suffering, if they truly view us as an entirely different, inferior species.
Exactly. It's Adamic versus Cainite. It's the ultimate us versus them mentality.
So we have the Bloodlines as the soul, the Illuminati as the brain or inner circle, and the Masons as the outer shell. But how does this actually touch my life? Because the Rothschilds aren't coming to my house to tell me what to do.
No, they need hands to do the work. They need administrative tools to shape society. And this is where the texts introduce the front organizations.
The alphabet soup agencies.
Right. The texts list the big ones: the United Nations, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, and the Club of Rome.
Now, I've heard politicians and journalists talk about the CFR. They usually just call it a prestigious think tank.
But the term think tank implies they just sit around and ponder ideas. The sources argue these are the actual policy arms of the hidden hand. For example, they claim that the CFR in the United States and the Royal Institute of International Affairs in Britain are effectively the exact same organization.
Just different branches.
Right. Their job is to take the broad orders from the Council of 13 and translate them into actionable government policy.
So if the plan is to, say, erase a national border or start a regional war, the council decides it, and then the CFR writes the academic white paper that convinces the president to actually pull the trigger.
That's the exact mechanism described. And the sources point out how many presidents, secretaries of state, and CIA directors are members of the CFR. They argue this isn't a coincidence or just a networking club. It's a hiring pool.
You don't get the job unless you're vetted by the front organization.
Right. You don't get to the White House unless you play ball with these groups.
Which really explains why foreign policy often feels completely identical, regardless of who is president, Republican, Democrat. The agenda just marches on.
That is exactly the point the sources make. They refer to it as a one-party state, cleverly disguised as a two-party democracy.
Okay, that covers the anatomy of the beast. We have the structure. But a machine this massive, spanning the whole globe, it needs fuel. You can't run a multi-century global conspiracy on good vibes.
No, you definitely can't. You need unimaginable amounts of capital. You have to control the flow of value itself.
Which brings us to Section 2, the financial engine. And in these texts, all roads seem to lead back to one specific name.
The Rothschild dynasty.
The sources literally call them the kings of kings.
The focus on the Rothschild family in these texts is intense. And to understand why, you have to go back to their origin story. Mayor Amschel Rothschild in Frankfurt, Germany, back in the 1700s.
Some man with the red shield.
Yes. Rothschild translates to red shield. It was a sign that hung on his house. The texts claim he didn't just build a successful bank. He built a dynasty based on a very specific set of occult and financial principles, one being the absolute ironclad secrecy of the family's total wealth.
And the other being the power of compound interest.
Right. There's that famous quote attributed to him: "Give me control of a nation's money and I care not who makes the laws."
Whether he actually said those exact words or not, the sources argue that is the exact philosophy they executed perfectly.
The hidden hand in history, from a financial perspective, is described as the ability to finance both sides of a major war.
And this is the part I find absolutely fascinating. Because logically, why would you fund your enemy? Why fund the guy fighting the army you just backed?
Because you're not betting on a winner. You're betting on the conflict itself. The sources discuss the Napoleonic Wars in great detail to illustrate this. They claim the Rothschilds funded Napoleon's army and simultaneously funded the British and coalition forces fighting against him.
So no matter who wins at Waterloo,
The Rothschilds win. Think about it. If you loan a massive amount of money to a government to fight a war, that government owes you the principal plus compound interest. If they win, they pay you back by taxing their citizens.
yeah, and if they lose.
If they lose, their country is devastated, they are desperate, and they have to borrow even more money from you just to rebuild.
It's a win-win for the international banker and a catastrophic lose-lose for the general population.
Exactly. And the sources claim they pulled off a massive stock market manipulation right after the Battle of Waterloo, which effectively gave them total control of the British economy and the Bank of England. But the real jewel in the crown, according to these texts, isn't over in London. It's in Washington, D.C.
You're talking about the Federal Reserve.
Yes. The sources, specifically Eustace Mullen's book, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, are absolutely adamant about this. The Federal Reserve is not federal. and it has no reserves.
It's not a government agency at all.
No more than Federal Express is a government agency. The sources describe it as a private corporation owned by the member banks, which ultimately trace back to these same international families, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the Rockefellers.
So when the news anchor says the Fed is printing money today, what is actually happening behind the scenes?
The source explains something called the Mandrake mechanism. It works like this. The U.S. government needs money for a project or a war. It goes to the Federal Reserve. The Fed gives the government cash, or more likely digital credits. In exchange, the government gives the Fed a bond, which is basically an IOU.
Okay, that sounds like a standard loan.
Right, but where did the Fed get the money they just gave to the government?
I assume they had it in a vault.
No, they didn't have it. They created it completely out of thin air, simply because the government asked for it. But here is the massive catch. The government has to pay that money back with interest.
Wait a second. If the Fed created the original loan money out of thin air, where does the money to pay the interest come from?
It doesn't exist. It was never created in the first place.
So let me get this straight. It's mathematically impossible to pay off the national debt.
Correct. By design. The system is engineered to generate perpetual, unpayable debt. The only way the government can find the money to pay the interest is to go back to the Fed and borrow more money.
Which creates more interest.
Exactly. It enslaves the government, and by extension the taxpayers, to the private bondholders forever. The sources argue this was the absolute coup de grace of American liberty, and it happened in 1913.
1913, the exact year the Federal Reserve Act was passed.
And what happened the very next year? 1914.
World War I begins.
The sources argue this was absolutely not a coincidence. You cannot fight a prolonged, global, mechanized war unless you have a central bank to magically print the money to pay for it.
They built the infinite credit card and then immediately started the shopping spree.
A shopping spree of death and debt, yes.
Now, we have to touch on the other highly controversial aspect of the Rothschild section in these sources, and that is Zionism. Because usually when you hear the name Rothschild and talk of global control, people immediately scream anti-Semitism.
And it is crucial, absolutely vital, to parse exactly what the sources are saying here so we report it accurately, because they make a very sharp, deliberate distinction.
Right. They distinguish between the everyday Jewish people and this supposed cabal.
Yes. The sources, particularly the Synagogue of Satan, argue that the Rothschilds and their allies created the Zionist movement and the State of Israel, but not for the benefit of the Jewish religion or the Jewish people.
So it wasn't a religious homecoming project for them.
They argue it was a purely geopolitical project. They claim the satanic hierarchy uses Jewish identity as a human shield. They hide behind the Star of David so that any attack on their financial or political crimes can be instantly dismissed as a hate crime.
It's the ultimate cover story. If you criticize the bank, you're a bigot.
The sources call them the Synagogue of Satan, which is a reference to the Book of Revelation. They argue these leaders are fake Jews, often referred to in the text as Khazarian or Edomite bloodlines, who have zero genetic or spiritual connection to the ancient Israelites of the Bible.
And they actually hate the real believers.
Yes, the texts claim they are the mortal enemies of Torah-observant Jews.
That completely flips the standard narrative. It suggests that the average Jewish person is just as much a victim, maybe even the primary victim of this group than anyone else.
That is exactly the argument presented. They claim this group uses the Jewish people as pawns on a chessboard, often deliberately sacrificing them in historical conflicts just to further the goals of the elite. It's a dark, deeply cynical strategy of hiding in plain sight.
So if they aren't following the Torah, and they clearly aren't following the U.S. Constitution, what exactly are they following? What is the actual religion of the hidden hand?
That brings us to Section 3, the spiritual core. And to understand it, we have to walk through the looking glass. We have to understand the concept of inversion.
Inversion, you mean like flipping everything upside down, black is white, up is down.
Exactly. The sources claim that this Satan organization practices the Babylon mystery religion. The theological core of this belief system is that the God of the Bible, Adonai, is actually the God of evil, the God of restriction and tyranny, and that Lucifer is the true God of light, freedom, and knowledge.
So good is evil, and evil is good.
It's ancient Gnosticism on steroids. They believe that to become gods themselves, they must systematically break every single law of Adonai. This is where you get the concept of redemption through sin.
Redemption through sin? How does that even work?
It's a concept closely linked to Sabbatean the Frankism, which was a movement in the 17th and 18th centuries. The leader, Jacob Frank, taught that the Messiah would only return when the entire world was either completely good or completely evil.
Right.
And since it's impossible to make everyone perfectly good, his logic was that we should make everyone completely evil to force the Messiah's hand.
That is incredibly twisted logic.
But highly effective for a criminal syndicate. It spiritually justifies every possible vice. Lying, stealing, murder, sexual depravity. In this inverted worldview, these aren't sins. They are considered holy acts that bring about the New World Order.
And the texts claim this belief system is hidden right in front of us in their symbols. Let's talk about the hexagram. Growing up, I always saw the six-pointed star and just thought, oh, the Star of David.
And most of the world does. But the sources, specifically a book called The Six-Pointed Star by O.J. Graham, argue that King David never actually used a star. He had no such symbol.
So where does it actually come from?
The sources trace it back to the Star of Remphan, or the Seal of Solomon. They argue that King Solomon, in his later years, fell deep into idolatry. He built altars to foreign gods like Ashtoreth and Moloch.
Moloch. That's the ancient god associated with child sacrifice, right?
Yes, often depicted as a giant bronze bull or an owl. The sources claim the hexagram was a magical talisman used specifically in the worship of Moloch and the planet Saturn. And if you break the star down numerologically...
I have a feeling the number 6 is going to be heavily involved here.
Very much so. It has 6 points. It forms 6 triangles on the outside, and it encloses a 6-sided hexagon in the center. 666.
The literal mark of the beast.
Hidden in plain sight on a flag. The sources argue the Rothschilds adopted this red hexagram, this red shield, as their family crest long before it was ever the flag of the modern state of Israel. They claim they essentially stamped their own occult family symbol onto the Jewish people.
Wow. What about the pentagram? The
Yep.
5-pointed star? Because we see that everywhere. On national flags, on military vehicles, on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
In regular masonry, the upright 5-pointed star is a crucial positive symbol. But the sources focus heavily on the inverted pentagram, with 2 points facing up.
That's the classic heavy metal satanic symbol.
It represents the goat of Mendes, Baphomet. The sources explain that the 2 points facing upward represent the horns of the goat actively attacking heaven. It's a direct visual challenge to God.
And they use this openly.
They point out that the official logo of the Order of the Eastern Star, which is a Masonic group for women, is a massive inverted pentagram.
And what about the all-seeing eye? I'm looking at it on the back of a $1 bill right now.
The sources are very clear on this. That is absolutely not the eye of the Christian God. It is the eye of Osiris, or Horus, from Egyptian mythology. It is the eye of the god of light, Lucifer, watching over the unfinished pyramid of human society.
The pyramid represents the building of the New World Order.
Yes. Just look at the Latin written underneath it on your dollar bill, Novus Ordo Seclorum. It translates directly to New Order of the Ages. The sources argue the United States was founded, or at least hijacked very early on, to be the primary military and economic engine to bring this specific order about.
No, we have to go darker. The sources talk about their rituals, and they talk about this concept of human batteries. I'll be honest, this was the part where I actually had to put the text down and take a walk.
It is undoubtedly the most disturbing aspect of the material. The texts claim that the elite hold an ancient occult belief that blood literally contains life force.
Right.
But they take it much further. They believe that deliberately terrorizing a victim, specifically an innocent child, right before death alters the blood and releases a highly potent form of energy.
This is the adrenochrome concept.
Yes. The sources allude to the severe chemical changes in the blood caused by extreme prolonged fear. They claim these dark entities, or the individuals performing the rituals, literally feed on this energy. They view the human victim as a disposable spiritual battery.
So when we hear about these massive rings of missing children or high-level abuse scandals,
The sources argue it's not just random, disorganized crime by sick individuals. It's industrial-scale ritual sacrifice. One of the sources actually estimates there are between 40,000 to 60,000 of these sacrifices occurring every single year in the U.S. alone.
that number is just staggering. It's almost impossible to comprehend.
It is. But the sources argue that the sheer global scale of the Satan organization requires this constant flow of fuel to maintain their power and to keep contact with their spiritual masters.
But if this is true, if it's happening on that scale, why doesn't the church stop it? Why doesn't law enforcement or the government stop it?
That leads us directly into Section 4, infiltration. Because the sources claim the hidden hand isn't fighting the authorities, they are the authorities. They're already wearing the religious robes and the tailored suits.
Okay, let's start with the Vatican. You would naturally think that the Pope would be the #1 absolute enemy of a global satanic organization.
You would certainly think so. But the sources dedicate a lot of time to the Vatican rat lines. Now, this part is documented historical fact. The Vatican actively helped top-level Nazi war criminals escape to South America after World War II.
Right, but why would they do that?
The sources argue is because the Vatican hierarchy, specifically the black nobility hiding within it, was secretly allied with the Nazis all along. They claim the Catholic Church has been thoroughly infiltrated by what they call Lucifer's Lodge.
Lucifer's Lodge. Inside the Vatican.
They point specifically to the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. The sources describe the Jesuits not as humble scholarly priests, but as the ruthless intelligence and military arm of the Vatican. One source goes so far as to call the superior general of the Jesuits the Black Pope.
The Black Pope. And he's the one who holds the real power.
That's the core claim, that the white Pope, the friendly guy we see on the balcony and that the Pope-mobile, is just a front man for public relations. But the Black Pope runs the actual geopolitical strategy in the shadows. They allege the Jesuits basically act as the Catholic branch of the Illuminati.
And they point to the symbolism here too, right? The bent cross.
Yes, the twisted crucifix. It's a staff used by several popes since the Vatican II Council. The sources say this is a known, documented satanic symbol representing a starving, emaciated, distorted Christ.
So they are mocking their own followers.
They argue it's a deliberate mockery held right up to the faces of the faithful who simply don't know any better.
Okay, so if the church is totally compromised, surely there are good guys in the secular government fighting back. The intelligence agencies, the military.
The sources say you have to look at the history of treason. Look at the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia.
This is a huge historical point in the text, because in school, we are taught that the Russian Revolution was an organic, grassroots uprising of the poor peasants against the rich, tyrannical czar.
And the sources say that narrative is a complete fabrication. They claim the entire revolution was funded by Wall Street. Men like Jacob Schiff and the Rothschild bankers poured millions of dollars into arming Lenin and Trotsky.
But wait a minute. Why would super-capitalist billionaires fund super-communists who want to destroy capitalism? That seems completely counterproductive.
It does, until you understand the Hegelian dialectic. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The bankers wanted to destroy the Tsar because he refused to play ball with their central banking system. And more importantly, they wanted to test communism as a system of total human control.
So the entire nation of Russia was just a laboratory?
A giant laboratory for the New World Order. They wanted to see if they could completely crush a massive population spirit, eradicate traditional religion, and run a tightly controlled command economy.
And once they figured out how to do it effectively there,
they started bringing those psychological techniques back home to the West. Which brings us to the CIA and the concept of mind control.
Project MKUltra.
The CIA's illegal mind control program. We know for a fact it existed. The government documents were declassified and released. But the sources go much deeper than the official narrative. They talk about monarch programming.
Explain monarch. How does that actually work?
It relies entirely on severe trauma. The theory is that if you torture a child severely enough through electric shock, sexual abuse, hallucinogenic drugs, the human mind simply shatters. It cannot handle the pain, so it dissociates to survive.
So it splits into different pieces?
Yes. It splits into separate compartmentalized personalities, which they call alters.
Kind of like multiple personality disorder.
Exactly like that, but artificially induced on purpose. The handler can then program these specific alters. One personality is programmed to be a high-end sex slave, another is a courier for illicit funds, another is a trained killer.
And the person doesn't even know.
When the victim is in their normal, everyday state, they have absolutely zero memory of what the other alters have done.
The ultimate Manchurian candidate.
Yes. The sources claim this is exactly how they control prominent politicians and celebrities. They use these monarch slaves as honeypots. They get a targeted politician in a hotel room with a compromised minor, film the entire thing, and from that moment on, they own that politician's vote forever.
This connects to the Franklin cover-up mentioned in the texts.
Right. A very specific, dark scandal from the late 80s involving high-level politicians in Washington, D.C. and Omaha, Nebraska. The sources argue it wasn't an isolated incident. It was a rare, brief glimpse into this nationwide systemic blackmail ring.
But if all this is happening, what happens if an honest journalist or an investigator tries to expose it? If someone actually gets too close to the truth?
The ADL steps in.
The Anti-Defamation League.
The sources characterize the ADL very differently than the mainstream does. They view it not as a noble civil rights group fighting racism, but as a ruthless intelligence front, originally founded by B'nai B'rith, which is a Jewish Masonic order.
So what is their actual function, according to the texts?
They claim the ADL's primary job is to act as a silencer. Their role is to immediately label anyone who investigates the financial or political crimes of the Satan organization as an anti-Semite.
It's the ultimate defense mechanism.
It really is. You can't effectively investigate or criticize the criminal syndicate if you, your publisher, and your family are terrified of being publicly destroyed and labeled as a bigot.
So they have the central banks, they have the church hierarchy, they have the intelligence agencies, and they have the media silencers. But the texts point out there is one more battlefield, and it's the battlefield right between our ears. Section 5, Social Engineering and the War on the Mind.
This is where we are introduced to the Tavistock Institute.
The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, based over in London.
The sources call it the world's absolute center for mass brainwashing and social engineering, and they drop a massive bombshell regarding the 1960s.
You're talking about the counterculture movement, the summer of love, the hippies.
The sources claim the entire counterculture was artificially manufactured. They argue that the Tavistock Institute spent years studying how to break the psychological resilience of Western nations.
And what did they find?
They concluded that the strong nuclear family unit and foundational Christian values were the primary obstacles to a New World Order.
So they needed a way to destroy those foundations. How did they do it?
By strategically introducing a culture of hard drugs, anti-authoritarian rebellion, and sexual chaos, and their primary delivery mechanism to the youth, the Beatles.
The Fab Four, come on, you're telling me I Want to Hold Your Hand was a psychological operation.
The sources, specifically a book by John Coleman called The Committee of 300, argue exactly that. They claim the Beatles were a complete creation of Tavistock. Their unique look, their changing sound, their massive global promotion, it was all meticulously engineered to target and mold the youth. They point specifically to the sudden influx of drugs.
LSD.
Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. The sources claim the intelligence agencies literally manufactured and distributed LSD to college campuses nationwide to, quote-unquote, open the minds of the youth, which in reality meant violently detaching them from reality and traditional morality.
And then there's this Belling T. Pepper album cover.
Right, who is featured prominently on that cover, Aleister Crowley.
The man who called himself the Great Beast 666.
The most notorious, openly practicing Satanist of the 20th century. The sources ask a very simple question. Why would the world's most lovable pop band choose to honor a dark occultist on their masterpiece album unless they were swimming in the same spiritual stream?
It's a completely fair question, and the texts say it's not just music doing this, it's the public school system too.
Yes, the National Education Association, or the NEA. The sources accuse the top leadership of the NEA of pushing a secular humanist or even witchcraft-based agenda, specifically designed to systematically destroy the Christian faith of children.
They talk a lot about the dumbing down of America.
The deliberate shift away from teaching actual phonics, classical history, and rigid logic toward what they call outcome-based education.
All right.
The sources argue the ultimate goal of the public school system isn't to educate brilliant thinkers, it's to socialize compliant citizens. They want to create workers who are just smart enough to run the factory machines, but far too docile to ever question the factory owners.
And on top of the psychological warfare, there's physical, biological warfare on the population. Things like fluoridation and vaccines.
The sources refer to these things as poison candy or Van Dyne candy, implying they are consumer products intentionally designed to weaken our physical bodies.
So they view water fluoridation not as a great public health victory for dental hygiene?
No, they view it as a chemical compound used to calcify the pineal gland in the brain and to gradually lower the IQ of the general population to make them more manageable. Similarly, they view mass vaccination programs as a Trojan horse delivery system for stealth sterilization or long-term disease.
It all feels so incredibly coordinated. I mean,
Yeah.
How do they move all these massive societal pieces at the exact same time without everyone catching on?
We mentioned it briefly before, but this is the master key to their strategy, the Hegelian dialectic. Problem, reaction, solution.
Give me a concrete example of how they use this.
Let's look at 9/11 through the lens of these sources. They would argue that the problem was the horrific terror attacks, the public reaction was extreme fear, and an immediate demand for the government to provide safety at any cost.
Right.
And the solution offered by the government was the Patriot Act, massive, unprecedented domestic surveillance, the total loss of digital privacy, and endless profitable wars in the Middle East.
Things the hidden hand wanted all along but could never have passed on a normal Tuesday.
Exactly. They engineer the chaotic problem, specifically to justify the draconian control they had waiting in the wings.
So where does this dark road finally end? That brings us to Section 6, the endgame. What exactly is the final New World Order?
To understand the end game, the sources point directly to the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. Now, mainstream history universally tells us this document is a complete anti-Semitic forgery created by the Russian secret police.
But the sources disagree.
The sources say, just read it, regardless of who actually penned it, it accurately predicts the total monopolization of the press, the intentional use of recurring economic crises, and the systematic destruction of the old aristocracy. They treat it as the literal working blueprint.
And the final goal of that blueprint is total global centralization.
A one-world government, a one-world digital currency, and ultimately a one-world religion.
But logically, there is a massive logistical problem with that. There are way too many of us to control.
Which brings us to depopulation. This is without a doubt the darkest pillar of their endgame. The sources point to things like the Georgia Guidestones.
That's the massive granite monument in Georgia that mysteriously got blown up recently. But for decades, it stood there engraved with 10 new commandments for humanity. What was the very first commandment?
Maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature.
There are over 8 billion people on the planet right now. To get down to 500 million?
You have to systematically eliminate over 90% of the human race. The sources mention specific alleged plots like Operation Black Widow, which are plans to use engineered plagues, orchestrated famines, and global war to violently cull the herd.
Because they view the rest of us as what? Useless eaters.
Exactly. Useless eaters consuming resources that rightfully belong to the elite bloodlines.
And who is supposed to rule over the 500 million traumatized survivors?
The king despot. The sources become explicitly religious and apocalyptic here. They claim the ultimate final goal of the Satan organization is to physically seat a king of the world in Jerusalem.
You mean the Antichrist?
Yes, they believe he will rule the globe from a newly rebuilt Solomon's temple.
But to build a third temple, they would have to completely destroy the Dome of the Rock, which is currently sitting on that site.
Which would instantly trigger World War III with the entire Islamic world. The sources claim the elite are well aware of this. In fact, they welcome it, they know their time is short, and they are actively trying to force this final spiritual confrontation.
They want to literally summon their dark god into our physical dimension.
That is the ultimate claim of these texts, yes.
Man. So this deep dive today has literally taken us from the shiny bank vaults of Frankfurt to the dark ritual rooms in the basement, all the way to the apocalyptic end of the world.
It is an overwhelming amount of information. And I know for you listening, this might sound like an absolute inescapable nightmare.
It really does. So what do we do with all of this? What is the ultimate takeaway? The so what?
The main takeaway from synthesizing all these sources is the terrifying idea that absolutely nothing in history is accidental. If you buy into this worldview, even a little bit, you have to stop seeing history as a random series of blunders and natural events.
You start seeing it as a highly calculated chess match.
Exactly. A multi-generational chess match played by a satanic elite against the Adamic human race.
The sources want you to look at modern events happening right now. The push for centralized digital currency, massive tech censorship, engineered global pandemics, the breakdown of the family. They want you to look through the specific lens and ask yourself, is all of this just incredibly bad luck and political incompetence?
Or is it the plan? Is the machine nearing completion?
And if this hidden hand really is real, then their absolute greatest weapon isn't their endless money or their military power or their blackmail tapes.
None of those things.
It's the silence.
The total secrecy. The sources emphasize that the ultimate weapon of the elite is that they have successfully convinced the average rational person that they are just a ridiculous fairy tale, a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory.
There's that famous quote, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist."
And if the authors of these sources are right, he didn't just pull off a neat parlor trick. He built an inescapable, invisible global government.
That is a profoundly terrifying thought to leave on. But, as we said at the start, we aren't here to tell you what to believe or how to vote. We're simply opening the vault and showing you the documents.
The truth is out there somewhere in the shadows. You just have to be brave enough to look directly at it.
Thanks for taking the plunge with us today. This was certainly a deep one.
Absolutely the deepest one yet.
Take care of yourselves out there, and keep your eyes wide open.